Tuesday, I started teaching again at our denomination seminary, and we have several new students that came in. So before I started lecturing, I asked them to introduce themselves to me and to each other. And when we got to one particular student, she said, I'm married and I have 2 kids. One is 29 years old, and the second one is 8 years younger, and he is 21 years old. I had him in my latest stage of my life. I had him when I was 37, I think she said. And as I was listening to her speak out, I'm thinking to myself, well, I had my youngest when I was older than that, but my wife was older than her. We've read a few verses in chapter 21 where finally the birth of Isaac is recorded. I Googled, I typed in the oldest birth in history, and these are some of the people that I got. There was a woman named Dawn Brooke in 1997, gave birth to a child at the age of 59. A natural birth, natural way of conceiving. There was a woman named Maria del Carmen Busara de Lara, long name. She was 66 years old. There was another woman who topped her. Her name was Raho Devi Lohan, and she was 69 years old. And there was another woman who her name was Omkari Panwar from India, who was 70 years old. Can you imagine? These women from 66 to 70, they gave birth through in vitro insemination. This woman, Omkari Panwar, she was 70 years old, and she already had 2 grown daughters who were married and had their own children, but she wanted to give birth to a son. So their family sold a lot of their possessions to go to the doctor and to receive help to give birth to a son finally. But our text records a woman who is the oldest ever to give birth. Her name is Sarah. Does the Bible record how old she was? No, not exactly, but we're told in verse 5, it says Abram was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So we could figure out the age of Sarah was 90 years old because they were 10 years apart. Think back to chapter 12 of Genesis when God calls Abraham and Sarah. They were 75 and 65 respectively, and God promises them that God will make them into a great nation. These are the words that God utters to Abraham in chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I'll make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you and all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, he says. So when God called him in chapter 12, we're told that Abram was 75 years old. Now you've got to remember, even though they've been married for quite some time, they were childless. They didn't have any children. And there God comes to Abraham and Sarah and promises them, as they follow and submit to the leading of God, that God will make them into great nation. Not only that, but God will make Abraham's name great, and that he'll be a blessing, to all nations as well. That he will be an agent, a blessing to every nation on the earth. God was going to bless those who blessed Abraham and curse those who dishonored Abraham. Now you have to remember when you are young, right? When you get married at a young age, you realize you have plenty of time to have children, have your own family. If you get married at the age of 20, then, there's a possibility of 15 to 20 years where you could have children. But when you're called by God, and at the point where you're already beyond childbearing age, and God comes to Abraham and Sarah and promises them that He will make them into a great nation. Now think from a perspective, from a point of view of Abraham and Sarah. Now, if you were Abraham and Sarah, and God called you, and God made exactly the same promise that God made to Abraham and Sarah, that He'll make you into a great nation. Now, what would you normally expect? Would you expect Him to send you a child after 25 years? Probably not. You probably, expect a child immediately. I mean, you're already pretty old to begin with. If God called Abraham and Sarah at the age of 27 and 17, then it's a different story. Because they have many more years where they could have a child naturally. But when God calls you at a later stage in life, you expect God to deliver on His promises pretty quickly. But as we have seen already through chapters of Genesis, God doesn't give a child. God does not send a child. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years even. So what does Abraham and Sarah do? They decide, at least Sarah decides to give her maidservant to her husband, Hagar, thinking to herself, perhaps God is going to bless us and make us into a great nation through my maidservant. So at the age of 86, we are told that Abraham has a son, Ishmael, through Hagar. So 11 years has elapsed and nothing has happened, so they decide, well, maybe we should do something about it. And another 13-year passes when they're 99 and 89. When finally God appears and promises Abraham and Sarah, about this time next year, that you will have a son. Now I want you to flip back to chapter 17. Beginning verse 16. Well, let me read from verse 15 and on. God also said to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarah. Her name will be Sarah. I'll bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I'll bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Jump down to verse 21. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac from Sarah, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. So God gives promise to Abraham and Sarah at the age of 99 and 89 that God will give them a son the following year. But Abraham in his old age, he laughs to himself, thinking, would I have a son at the age of 100? Would my wife have a son at the age of 90? Now obviously, the laughter is not a laughter of joy, laughter of faith in God who is fulfilling His promises, perhaps sarcastic laughter coming from Abraham. Now turn your page to chapter 18, verse 10. Then the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent which was behind them. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. And so we don't forget that God specifically mentions that she was beyond childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I'm worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. you'll notice that Abraham laughed and Sarah also laughed, thinking to herself, I mean, how am I going to have a son at the age of 90 when menopause already has set in? There is no way possible for me to have a child physically. And yet God promises Abraham and Sarah that this time next year you shall have a son. So if you go back to chapter 21, verses 1 and 2, it says, Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. Now, from a perspective of Abraham and Sarah, they may be thinking God's promises are fulfilled way too slowly. I mean, we waited 25 years. I mean, we waited 24 years and he comes and promises that this time next year we'll have a son. Now, when they finally have a son at the age of 190, they're thinking to themselves, my goodness, it takes a long time for God to deliver on his promises. From human perspective, we may think God is slow in delivering his promises. But we need to remember, God delivers and fulfills his promises at just the right time. Because God's timing is different than ours, isn't it? Now we see what is right before us, right? We live in the present, and we know what has happened, what has transpired in our past, but we don't see anything beyond today. But God sees not only our yesterdays today, but he also sees our tomorrows. So he knows where he is leading, so he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows when it is best time to deliver on his promises. So God promises in chapter 12, 25 years ago, and 25 years later, God finally delivers on his promise. And it says in verse 1, God was gracious to Sarah, a woman who was beyond childbearing age, and yet God opens the womb of Sarah and makes it fertile once again. So God is God who is able to make promises, but he is God who is able to deliver and fulfill his promises. Now when you look at chapter 1 of Genesis, it records about God's creation account, right? And if you take time to read chapter 1 carefully, there are a few words that are repeated over and over again. God speaks things, right? God said. And whatever he said came into existence. It doesn't matter. If God says, let there be light, light has to appear because God is God. He is the creator God. He is the most almighty and powerful God. Whatever he utters, it must come into existence because he is God. So whatever he says, he comes into existence. Out of nothing into something. So we see in chapter 1, in 6 days, how God creates everything. And he says it was good. At the end of each creative account, it says it was good. And at the end of 6th day, God looks at vast array of all this creation. It says it was very good. So God is God who is able to do whatever he decides, whatever he chooses to do. Our God is God who promises and delivers and fulfills every promise that he makes to his people. So it will benefit all of us if we take time to read and to study and to meditate upon God's word, and to write upon our hearts the promises that God has made to his chosen people. Because we could take it to the bank. We could definitely believe and trust that God will deliver on everything that he has said, everything that he has promised, because if you take time to read the Bible, every promise that he has made, he has fulfilled. Every prophecy that he has uttered, he has fulfilled. So in the Old Testament, we see the prophecy of the Messiah, God's Son, coming, And in the New Testament, we see God delivering on his prophecy of sending the Messiah. And when you take time to read the New Testament, we see God prophesying about the second coming of Jesus Christ. And that too shall be fulfilled one of these days in our future. So God is God who promises, but more than that, God is God who is able to fulfill every promise. But we have to remember, God does things in his own timing, doesn't he? God does things in his own time frame. Now look at verse 3 and following. Abram gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. In light of what God has done, in light of God's gracious fulfilling of his promise, Abraham responds by obeying what God has told him to name his son. In chapter 17, verse 19, it says, God said, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him." So God has already, as he came to Abraham and Sarah, promising that he will give them a son the following year. Not only that, God has already told Abraham to give him the name Isaac. So remembering what God has said, Abraham names his son Isaac, which means he laughs. And the second thing that Abraham does, he circumcises Isaac on the 8th day. That's what it says in verse 4. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Now, what is circumcision? As we have already seen, it is a sign between God and God's chosen people that they've entered into this covenant relationship, that the Creator God will be their God and they will be God's chosen people. And to show the covenant relationship that Abraham and his descendants have entered into, Abraham had to circumcise every male. That's what it says in chapter 17. We're beginning verse 9. And God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring." So God specifically told and commanded Abraham to circumcise every male that is born in your household when they turn 8 days old. And that's what Abraham does with Isaac. Submitting and obeying what God has commanded him to do. Maybe verse 5 and following. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I had borne him a son in his old age." Now, Abraham's age is mentioned, right? He was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Sarah was 90 years old when she gave birth to Isaac. And Sarah says to herself, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." Abraham and Sarah will laugh, not because they're joyful that God was going to send them son at the age of 100, but perhaps their laughter was the laughter of unbelief. But now we see them laughing joyously because God has sent them a son. Now this is exactly the time that when God wanted to send the son into the life of Abraham and Sarah. Perhaps God waited all those years just to make sure that it was not humanly possible. And when they did have a son at the age of 190, that they cannot claim themselves that we did it. It was God who did it for us. That we received Isaac by God's grace, by God's love. Now you have to remember, brothers and sisters, we believe in God who is able to do anything and everything. There's a story in Matthew chapter 19 where a wealthy young man comes to Jesus Christ and asks about how to inherit eternal life. And Jesus Christ said, well, you know the law. I said, well, I've done all of them since I was young. And Jesus Christ looks at him and out of his love for him, he says, well, you lack one thing. You lack one thing. Go sell all your possession and give to the poor and come and follow me. And he says his face fell. He was saddened because he was extremely wealthy and he could not sell his possession and come follow Jesus Christ. So he departed from Jesus Christ. And immediately following that, Jesus Christ looks to his disciples and says this, truly I say to you, only with difficulty would a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished, saying, who then can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. With God. I love that statement. With men it may be impossible. With men there may be limitations. But with God there is no limitation. With God, all things, all inclusive of everything that you could possibly think of, all things are possible with God. Our God is God who created the universe. Our God is God who watches over and sustains the universe. Our God is God who controls everything. Our God is God who guides everything. Our God is God who looks after each and every one of you. It is God who holds on to you. It is God who is leading you into His glory. So as you look to your Heavenly Father, remember, He is able. There's nothing impossible for your Father. There's nothing impossible. All things. With God, all things are possible.